They called him Kitchen Boy with sneers, the quiet cook who earned his place in the mountain lodge through what they assumed was mere desperation from the owner. Some whispered he was just another city runaway, hiding from debts or a woman. Others thought the remote Golden Pine Resort was scraping the bottom of the barrel after losing their last 3 chefs to better opportunities in the valley. But here's something the Shadow Peak Bandits didn't count on. Sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a blade or a gun, but the careful hands that prepare your final meal. The Golden Pine Resort wasn't the kind of place that attracted much attention. Nestled high in the Cascade Mountains, where mist clung to ancient pines and the scent of wood smoke drifted from stone chimneys, it was a retreat where wealthy tourists came to escape the chaos of city life. For generations, the biggest excitement came from occasional bear sightings and the annual Winter Solstice Festival. That changed the day the Shadow Peak gang discovered its existence. James Chen stood at his kitchen window, watching dawn paint the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold. 4 weeks into his position as the youngest head chef in Golden Pine's history at just 32, and already facing what could be the biggest crisis the resort had seen since the avalanche of '95. His reflection stared back at him, quiet, unassuming almond eyes and delicate hands that some said were too refined for mountain cooking. "Another cache raided last night, Chef," Sarah Mackenzie announced, dropping a fresh inventory list on his cutting board. The veteran sous chef's voice carried that familiar edge of doubt, the same skepticism he'd been fighting since day one. The supply cellar, Shadow Peak boys tagged it with their mountain lion mark. 3rd one this month. People are starting to wonder if maybe you're not quite ready for this. James picked up the list, jaw tightening as he studied the numbers. The resort stores weren't just supplies. They were lifelines during the harsh mountain winters. The images in his mind showed scattered preserves, smashed jars, and that crude mountain lion sprayed across the cellar's heritage wooden doors, a deliberate insult to the lodge's 100-year history of hospitality. "They're getting bolder," Marcus Thompson observed, his weathered face grim as he joined them. 20 years as head of resort security had left silver streaks in his black hair and deep lines around his eyes. "Started with raids on the supply routes, moved to extortion from our suppliers, now they're hitting our stockpiles directly. State police called again. They're offering to send a tactical unit." The suggestion hung in the air like steam off a boiling pot, a subtle vote of no confidence wrapped in professional courtesy. James spread the inventory lists across his pristine steel workstation, eyes moving with practiced precision. Where others saw random destruction, he saw patterns. His time as a military field kitchen operator hadn't just taught him how to cook. It had taught him how to read situations, to see the story behind the chaos. "No," he replied firmly, tapping one particular inventory sheet. "The Shadow Peak gang is making a mistake, and calling in outside help would only prove what they're trying to tell our guests, that we can't handle our own problems." "Enlighten us, Kitchen Boy." Mackenzie leaned against a gleaming counter, arms crossed. What could you possibly see that 30 years of combined hospitality and security experience is missing? James pointed to the raided supplies. "Look at the selection pattern. Their usual raider, Bear Claw Mike, no relation to you, Sarah. He's methodical. Takes what preserves travel well, leaves the rest. This raid was sloppy, emotional. They destroyed more than they took, and what they did take." He grabbed a clipboard, making quick calculations. "The quantities are wrong. Bear Claw works in units of 8, enough to feed their usual raiding party. This was cleared out in units of 12. Thompson leaned in closer, his skepticism giving way to curiosity. "Go on. What else?" "The Shadow Peak gang is splintering," James continued, pulling up previous inventory reports. "These aren't coordinated raids anymore, they're internal power plays. Victor the Beast Kovacs is challenging Derek Stone's leadership. That's why these hits are getting messy, more frequent. They're not just trying to intimidate the resort, they're trying to prove themselves to each other." The conversation was interrupted by Eleanor burst into the kitchen, her usual graceful demeanor replaced by barely contained anger. The resort's owner, third generation of her family to run Golden Pine, clutched a crumpled note. "Chef, they just threatened my grandson. 2 of them at the ski lodge said if I don't start paying protection money, they'll make sure little Trevor never makes it back from his next skiing lesson." The ski lodge wasn't just any facility. It was Golden Pine's heart. 3 generations of mountain families had learned to ski on its slopes. The Shadow Peak gang had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. James stood, checking his knife roll with practiced efficiency, the same motion he'd performed thousands of times during his years in military kitchens, long before he'd ever set foot in this mountain resort. "They think I'm a joke," he said quietly. "A soft city cook who got lucky. But every time they underestimate me, they make another mistake. And this time..." He selected a particular blade, its edge catching the morning light. "This time, they just made their biggest one yet." Thunder rolled across the mountain peaks, its echo bouncing off ancient granite walls. A storm was coming to Golden Pine Resort, but not the kind that could be measured in snow or rain. The quiet cook they'd all doubted was about to show them that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the one that comes at you with guns blazing. It's the one that serves your last meal with a smile. The afternoon crowd at the Golden Pines main dining room had thinned to a few late skiers when James began his preparations. Steam rose from copper pots, the kitchen's usual symphony of bubbling broths and sizzling pans masking the tension in the air. Wealthy guests sipped hot chocolate, speaking in hushed tones about the Shadow Peak gang's latest threats. The usually bustling establishment felt subdued, like an avalanche building just beyond the ridgeline. "Well, if it ain't Kitchen Boy himself," a gravelly voice called out. Victor the Beast. Kovac's massive frame filled the kitchen doorway, his weathered hunting jacket adorned with the Shadow Peak mountain lion patch. A half-finished bowl of venison stew sat before him, 2 other gang members flanking his position. Their muddy boots had tracked snow across Eleanor's immaculate floor, their snowmobiles parked prominently outside the window. "Heard you've been studying our work, Chef," Kovac sneered, the title dripping with mockery. "Fancy yourself some kind of detective?" James moved deliberately through his kitchen, positioning himself with clear access to his equipment. His posture relaxed, but any trained observer would notice his right hand stayed near his knife roll, his stance balanced for quick movement. "Just admiring the efficiency, Victor," James replied, his voice carrying the measured calm of a man counting ingredients. "Though I noticed your boys are getting sloppy. Might want to coordinate better with Bear Claw next time. Wasting food is a cardinal sin in my kitchen." Kovac's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing his weathered face. "You got a smart mouth for a city boy. Maybe that's why Derek thinks you're more trouble than you're worth." "Trevor, go help your grandmother in the pantry," James called out to Eleanor's grandson, who was arranging dessert plates near the pass. The teenager hesitated, then caught the chef's stern look and disappeared through the swinging doors. The dining room had gone silent, the remaining guests watching the exchange with wary eyes. "Sending the kid away?" Kovac smirked, standing slowly, his frame towering over the cooking island. "Afraid he might see something unpleasant?" "Just making sure he doesn't have to testify about what happens next," James replied evenly, his hands moving smoothly across his workspace, selecting herbs with practiced precision. "You threatened a child today, Victor, in my resort. Did Derek authorize that? Or are you freelancing now?" The question hit like a precisely timed reduction. Kovac's companions exchanging glances, uncertainty creeping into their postures. James pressed the advantage, his knife making clean, measured cuts through aromatic herbs. The scent of fresh rosemary filled the air, almost masking the undercurrent of tension. "See, Kovac," James continued, his voice so quiet the bandits had to lean in to hear over the simmering pots. "You made 3 critical mistakes today. First, you came into my kitchen uninvited. Second, you interrupted my prep time." His knife flashed in the afternoon light, splitting a garlic clove with surgical precision. "And third, you did it all while your bowl of stew is still half full." "Or what, kitchen boy?" Kovac growled, though something in James's tone made him glance down at his bowl. "You gonna chop us up with those fancy knives?" James's response was measured, calculated like a complex recipe. "Victor, if you take another bite of that stew, you'll find out exactly why they used to call me Last Meal Chen before I ever became a chef." Something in his voice, perhaps the absolute certainty, or maybe the complete lack of theatrics, made Kovac pause. His eyes met James's and saw something that made him step back. Without breaking eye contact, he reached for his wallet, dropped some bills on the counter, and muttered what might have been an apology in Eleanor's direction. As the bandits filed out, their bravado notably diminished, Thompson moved beside James. You knew they wouldn't finish their meals. How? James watched through the window as the snowmobiles roared to life, their engines competing with the growing mountain winds. Kovac likes to project strength, but he's cautious. More importantly, he just confirmed something I suspected. Derek Stone didn't authorize these escalations, which means the Shadow Peak gang is about to have some internal problems we can use to our advantage. Eleanor emerged from the pantry, Trevor close behind her. Chef, she began, but James raised a hand. Eleanor, I need you to close the dining room early today. Then I need you to call a staff meeting. It's time Golden Pine understood exactly what we're dealing with and what we're going to do about it. Thunder rolled across the peaks as dark clouds gathered over the ancient pines. A storm was coming to Golden Pine Resort, but James Chen had learned long ago in places far more dangerous than this that sometimes the best way to weather a storm was to let your enemies think they had already won. The quiet cook they'd mocked was about to show them that in his kitchen, every dish served had a purpose, and some recipes were never meant to see the light of day. The Shadow Peak gang was about to learn why James's old unit had a standing order never to let him cook for their enemies, and why some of the most dangerous weapons in warfare came not with a bang, but with a perfectly plated meal. The staff meeting was packed, every employee crammed into the resort's grand dining hall from housekeepers to ski instructors. The evening storm had broken, leaving the air sharp with pine and wood smoke. James stood at the head of the great oak table, surveying the faces before him. His white chef's coat, usually pristine, still bore traces of the day's confrontation, a subtle reminder of what had brought them here. 3 months ago, James began, his voice carrying to every corner, the Shadow Peak gang thought they found an easy target, a luxury resort with a city chef, isolated in the mountains. Last week they raided 4 supply caches. Yesterday, they threatened a child. Today, they learned that Golden Pine Resort isn't as soft as they thought. He moved to a large corkboard, usually reserved for menu planning, now marked with red pins showing every incident since the gang's arrival. But what they don't know is that every act of intimidation, every show of force has been giving us exactly what we need to take them down. Sarah Mackenzie stepped forward, distributing detailed inventory logs to the department heads. The veteran sous chef's earlier skepticism had been replaced by professional focus. The Shadow Peak gang isn't just a group of mountain bandits, she explained, her voice steady. They're an organized criminal operation in the middle of a power struggle. Derek Stone built them on a twisted code of honor. No targeting families, no excessive waste. But Victor Kovac is trying to change that. Which means, Thompson added, they're getting sloppy, making mistakes. And our chef here has been documenting every single one. James clicked through a series of photographs on the dining room's presentation screen, normally used for wine pairing demonstrations. They showed supply raids, threatened vendors, intercepted deliveries, all methodically cataloged. They think they're watching us, James continued, but we've been watching them. Every protection payment they've extorted, every threat they've made, it's all evidence, but we need your help to spring the trap. Old Jack, the resort's veteran ski instructor, stood up, his weathered face set with determination. What kind of help, chef? Because I've got access to every hunting rifle in the valley. Not that kind, James replied firmly. The Shadow Peak gang is expecting violence. They're counting on it. What they don't expect is a resort that stands together. He turned to Eleanor. Tell them about your idea. Eleanor rose, her usual grace tinged with iron resolve. The lodge has always been neutral ground. Everyone eats here. Locals, tourists, even those bandits. I'm proposing we host the Midwinter Feast next weekend. Traditional mountain cuisine, live music, the works. The kind of event that draws everyone from miles around. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the staff. James raised his hand for silence. The Shadow Peak gang will see it as a sign of weakness, a resort trying to pretend everything's normal. They won't be able to resist making a statement. He nodded to Sarah, who wheeled out a large case. Inside were sophisticated food testing kits and monitoring equipment. Before I became a chef, James explained, I specialized in a very particular type of military operation. Every server at that feast will be equipped with these. He held up what looked like a simple wine testing strip. Every dish will be monitored, and when Kovac makes his move against Stone's leadership, we'll have everything we need. You're using us as bait? A young housekeeper called out, fear evident in her voice. No, James corrected, his voice gentle but firm. I'm asking you to show them what they've never understood. That real strength isn't about fear. It's about community. Every time they've attacked, this resort has pulled together. Now we're going to use that unity to end this. He outlined the security measures, the evacuation plans, the coordination with state police who would be positioned in the valley below. But more importantly, he explained how each staff member had a part to play in maintaining the illusion of a resort, too naive to realize it was walking into a confrontation. There's something else, Thompson added, something the Shadow Peak gang doesn't know about our chef. Want to tell them, James? Or should I? James hesitated, then nodded. Before I took this position, I served in a specialized unit. They didn't call me Last Meal Chen because I was a good cook. They called me that because in my unit's history, I'm the only field operator who never lost a target that ate my food. He let that sink in. They mock me as kitchen boy as a joke, but next weekend, if Kovac forces a confrontation, he's going to learn differently. The meeting continued late into the night, questions answered, concerns addressed, roles assigned. As staff filed out, there was a new energy in the air, not the nervous tension of recent weeks, but the quiet determination of a community that had found its strength. Eleanor lingered behind, Trevor holding her hand. Chef, are you sure about this? Using my family's feast as the centerpiece? James checked his knife roll, a habit that had become almost unconscious. The Shadow Peak gang thinks they understand power. They're about to learn that real power isn't in how many people fear you. It's in how many trust you enough to eat your food. Thunder rolled again across the peaks, distant but clear. In 6 days, Golden Pine Resort would either break free from the Shadow Peak gang's grip, or... James pushed the alternative from his mind. Failure wasn't an option, not with his resort counting on him. The pieces were in motion, the trap was set, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, 2 rival gang leaders were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives, underestimating a chef who had been 3 steps ahead of them all along, preparing not just meals, but justice served cold. The week before the midwinter feast passed like a slow-motion dance in James's kitchen. He watched from his prep station as staff hung elaborate ice sculptures and traditional mountain garlands across the grand dining hall, their cheerful arrangements masking the tension beneath. His workspace was covered with recipes, ingredient lists, and a detailed map of the dining room layout, each table numbered and coded. Shadow Peak riders spotted at the valley checkpoint, Sarah reported, entering with fresh intelligence. 12 bikes, including Kovac and Bearclaw. Derek Stone's group was seen heading down from the north face. Looking like your prediction about their split is dead on. James nodded, testing the edge of a blade for the 100th time that morning. The familiar weight of his professional Kramer knife offered small comfort. And our backup? State police units? Positioned at all access roads, disguised as snowplow crews, FBI tactical team is standing by at the ranger station, 20 minutes out. Undercover agents are already checking in as guests. She paused, studying him. You really think Kovac will make his move against Stone here? He doesn't have a choice, James replied, marking another position on the dining room diagram. Stone's been asking questions about the unauthorized raids, the escalating violence. Kovac needs to make a show of force before his support crumbles. What better way than taking over in front of the whole mountain community? Thompson entered, his weathered face grave beneath his security cap. Just got word from our contact inside the gang. Kovac has been promising his supporters bigger cuts of the protection money, less oversight. He's got maybe 15 riders ready to flip on Stone. But here's the concerning part. They've been asking around about something that could take out a whole dining room. James's jaw tightened. He'd anticipated violence, but this raised the stakes considerably. They weren't just planning a confrontation. Kovacs wanted to make a statement, something public that would show the entire mountain what happens to establishments that resist. Eleanor burst in, her usual composure shattered. "Chef, two of Kovacs' men just left the bar. They were talking about making tomorrow's feast one nobody would forget. They didn't know Trevor was restocking the firewood, heard everything. They're planning something big during the main course." "That's what I'm counting on," James said, pulling out detailed molecular diagrams he'd been working on all week. "Eleanor, remember how we reinforced the wine cellar last week? We didn't just do that for storage." He turned to his team, energy radiating from his lean frame. "Kovacs thinks he's planning a coup. What he doesn't know is that every step he takes brings him closer to a trap 6 months in the making." Sarah appeared carrying cases of specialized equipment. "Testing kits are in place, Chef. Every service station has the markers, every glass has been treated. If anyone so much as adds the wrong sweetener to their coffee, we'll know about it." James moved to the evidence wall where photos tracked the Shadow Peak gang's activities since their arrival. Tomorrow isn't just about stopping a gang war. It's about showing Golden Pine Resort and every establishment like it that you don't need guns or violence to stand against intimidation. Sometimes all you need is a community willing to stand together. "And a chef crazy enough to use a holiday feast as bait," Sarah finished, but there was respect in her voice now. "They call me kitchen boy like it's a joke," James said quietly, arranging his specialized herbs with practiced precision. "By tomorrow night, they'll understand why that name used to make enemy commanders order their men to carry their own rations rather than risk eating my cooking." Thunder rolled across the peaks as the team dispersed to final preparations. James remained at his station, watching storm clouds gather over the ancient pines. Tomorrow would test not just his skills with a blade, but everything he believed about justice, community, and the kind of courage it takes to stand against those who rule through fear. The city chef they'd all doubted was about to show the Shadow Peak gang exactly why you should never judge a person's capabilities by their choice of weapons. In the military, they'd called him a specialist, not because he could kill with a knife, but because he knew how to turn a simple meal into an invisible weapon. "Final inventory check, Chef," Sarah announced, returning with a clipboard. "Every ingredient accounted for, including your special additions?" James nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of a small vial hidden in his knife roll. The contents had cost him more favors than he cared to remember, but his old unit had come through. "Some recipes require very particular ingredients, Sarah. Timing is everything, in cooking and in justice." Through the kitchen window, he could see the first snowflakes beginning to fall. Tomorrow's feast would bring the entire mountain community together, just as it had for generations. But this year, between the traditional courses and holiday toasts, justice would be served with a precision that only a master of his craft could achieve. The quiet cook they'd mocked was about to remind everyone that in the oldest stories, the most dangerous potions always came disguised as the sweetest wines. The Shadow Peak gang was about to learn why James's military file was still classified, and why some chefs' greatest weapons weren't their knives, but their knowledge of how to turn nature's bounty into nature's vengeance. The dawn of the midwinter feast broke crisp and clear, golden light spilling across fresh snow like honey on white linen. James stood in his command center, the private kitchen he'd established in the reinforced wine cellar, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from every service station positioned throughout the grand dining hall above. "All units, check in," he commanded through the secure radio channel, his voice carrying the same authority that had once directed covert operations in far deadlier environments. "Mackenzie at the main entrance, clear. Thompson covering the bar in position. Wilson at the service corridor, all waitstaff accounted for. State police units standing by at all exit points." The feast was coming to life above them. The scent of roasting meats and mulled wine drifted down even to the cellar, masking the subtle chemical hints of James's more specialized preparations. The first guests were already arriving, their excited chatter a stark contrast to the tension humming through the security network. "First Shadow Peak riders spotted," Sarah's voice crackled. "Kovac's group, 12 bikes. They're splitting up, taking positions around the perimeter, Just like you predicted, Chef. And Stone? James watched the thermal imaging screens, tracking the biker's movements with the same precision he once used to monitor target vitals. Coming in from the upper lodge, Thompson reported. Looks like he brought his whole crew. This could get ugly fast. Keep your positions, James ordered, adjusting the temperature on a simmering pot that contained far more than just broth. Remember, we need them all seated before we move. Eleanor, how's the crowd management going? Eleanor's voice came through clear and steady. The ski instructors are doing a good job keeping regular guests toward the designated safe zones. Nobody suspects anything beyond a traditional feast. James checked his preparations one final time. Each specialized compound measured with the precision that had made him legendary in certain classified circles. Years of experience had taught him that the moment before action was often more dangerous than the action itself. That's when mistakes happened. Movement at the main table, Wilson called out urgently. Kovac's men are getting into position. Chef, they're carrying something in their jackets, thermal imaging showing unusual patterns. Right on schedule, James replied, his voice deadly calm. Thompson, confirm Stone's location. He's just past the appetizer station, heading straight for Kovac. Got at least 15 riders with him. James stood, adjusting his chef's coat with practiced precision. All units, execute Phase 1. Sarah, start the mountain music. Traditional alpine horns blasted through the dining room speakers, masking the sound of security teams moving into position. Through the monitors, James watched as Derek Stone confronted Kovac near the main table, their body language screaming hostility even without audio. They're arguing, Sarah reported. Kovac just shoved Stone. Chef, I'm seeing multiple hands moving toward weapons. Wait, something else. They're starting to eat the first course. Perfect, James whispered. Remember, we need to contain this before the main course. That's when Kovac plans to make his move. He emerged from the cellar just as the first complaints began. Gang members were starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats, faces flushing, a peculiar numbness spreading through their extremities. Well, well, James's voice cut through the growing unease. I see you're enjoying the appetizers. I prepared them specially for our honored guests. What? What did you do? Kovac's voice was slurred, his massive frame swaying slightly as he tried to stand. You see, Victor, James moved through the dining room with practiced grace. Every chef has their specialties. Some focus on French cuisine, others on pastries. My specialty? I carry on a much older tradition. The ancient art of understanding which natural compounds, when combined just so, can render a man unable to lift a weapon, unable to fight, unable to do anything but listen as justice is served. Stone struggled to reach for his gun, but his arms felt like lead. Around the room, gang members were slumping in their chairs, conscious but unable to move effectively. None of the other guests showed any signs of distress. Their meals had come from a different kitchen entirely. The main course would have been much worse, James continued, lifting a covered dish. This is what your men smuggled in, isn't it, Victor? A little something to take out the whole room? Amateur work, really. In my line of expertise, we call this poetic justice. You're not just a chef, Stone managed to slur out. No, James agreed, checking his watch as state police began moving in. Before I ran kitchens, I ran a very specialized kind of operation. The kind where the difference between success and failure often came down to what someone ate for their last meal. They called me kitchen boy as a joke. Back in the service, they called me something else, the Last Supper specialist. The quiet cook's trap had sprung, and as thunder rolled across the mountain peaks, the Shadow Peak gang was learning too late why some of the deadliest weapons in history came not with a bang or a blade, but with a perfectly plated meal served by steady hands that knew exactly how to deliver justice, one carefully measured dose at a time. Time seemed to slow in the aftermath of James's revelation, the grand dining hall frozen in a tableau of justice served cold. Kovac stared at his half-finished plate, sweat beading on his forehead, his powerful frame betrayed by muscles that no longer answered his commands. Around the dining room, both factions of Shadow Peak riders sat immobilized, their weapons within reach but their hands unable to bridge that crucial distance. Those were just the aperitifs, James announced, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. A special blend of natural compounds. Nothing lethal, I assure you. Just incapacitating. The effects will last precisely long enough for law enforcement to do their job. The human body is fascinating that way. Just like a perfectly timed soufflé, it's all about precision. Derek Stone managed to find his voice, though his words came thick and slow. You planned this in all along. Of course, James replied, moving between the tables with the same deliberate grace he used in his kitchen. Every raid you conducted, every supply line you disrupted, you were actually helping me stockpile exactly what I needed. Those herb gardens you destroyed, they weren't for cooking. Well, not entirely. Martinez's voice crackled in his earpiece. State police moving in from all access points. FBI tactical team 3 minutes out. All exits secured. Your supplier for that little surprise you planned for the main course? James continued, addressing both gang leaders. He works for us, has been for months, and he's got recordings of every conversation, every plan, every detail of your operation. But here's what you don't know yet. Kovac sneered, though the expression was somewhat undermined by his inability to keep his head upright. You're bluffing, kitchen boy. No resort chef pulls off something this complex. James allowed himself a small smile, the kind that had once made hardened warriors push away their rations. That's your problem, Victor. You saw what you wanted to see. A city chef, an easy target. You never asked why someone with my background would choose a remote mountain resort. Thompson, tell them about the other operations. The security chief emerged from his position, covering the left flank. Tell them, Chef. Tell them what happened to the last 3 criminal organizations that tried to take over mountain resorts across the Cascades. Interesting pattern, isn't it? James replied, his movements precise as he collected plates with gloved hands. Each time a new chef arrives. A few months later, entire criminal operations simply dissolve. No violence, no bloodshed. Just a series of unexplained illnesses followed by perfectly timed police interventions. The papers called it the Mountain Mystery. My old unit called it Operation Clean Kitchen. The sound of police sirens filled the crisp mountain air as state police vehicles converged on the resort. FBI tactical teams deployed with practiced precision, securing the perimeter. But James kept his focus on the gang leaders, knowing these next moments were crucial. You've got 2 choices, he continued, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used when explaining complex recipes. Surrender now, face federal charges for attempted domestic terrorism, or... He let the alternative hang in the air, gesturing to their half-finished plates. Stone broke first, his survival instincts overriding his pride. Stand down, he slurred to his men, his head dropping to the table. The mountain ain't worth dying for. Kovac looked around wildly, seeing his power play crumbling along with his motor control. With a roar of frustrated rage, he managed to lunge toward a fallen knife, his movement more collapse than attack. James's response was instantaneous, precise. A simple sidestep, followed by a carefully measured dose of clear liquid added to Kovac's water glass. That's the interesting thing about molecular gastronomy, James commented calmly, watching Kovac's remaining strength fade. It's all about understanding reactions, like how certain compounds, when combined with what's already in your system, can multiply their effects. Want to try for another move? The fight drained from Kovac's face as the additional dose took effect. Around the dining room, Shadow Peak riders were being carefully collected by tactical teams while FBI agents secured weapons and gathered evidence. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, Trevor close behind her, carrying sealed containers of everything they'd documented. The surveillance footage is secured, Chef, she called out. Every conversation, every plate, every reaction, all recorded and time-stamped. James finally relaxed his stance, watching as the gang members were led away. The dining room lay in elegant disarray, scattered silverware, half-finished plates, napkins dropped in haste. But no casualties, no injuries, no violence. The plan had worked perfectly. You know, Thompson said, joining him as the last of the riders was escorted out. When Eleanor hired you, I thought the resort had lost its mind. A military specialist playing chef in the mountains. But now I understand. You didn't just bring chemical knowledge to Golden Pine. You brought strategy, patience, and something these riders never understood. "What's that?" James asked, carefully storing his specialized equipment. The understanding that true power isn't about how many people you can hurt. It's about knowing how to end a fight before it begins. About turning an enemy's strength into their weakness. About making their own appetites their undoing. Thunder rolled across the peaks, but this time it sounded more like applause. Golden Pine Resort had faced down its threat, not through force of arms or violent confrontation, but through the careful calculations of a chef who understood that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a gun or a knife. It's knowing exactly what your enemy will choose to put in their own mouth. In the days following the Shadow Peak gang's takedown, a deeper story began to emerge. James sat in his office adjacent to the kitchen, reviewing interrogation reports, each new detail confirming his suspicions that there was more to this gang than met the eye. "Chef, you need to see this," Sarah burst in, clutching a stack of files. "We've been going through Kovach's phone records. The calls don't just go to other gang members. There's a pattern of communication with someone in the state tourism board." James spread the phone logs across his pristine workstation, his tactical mind piecing together connections like ingredients in a complex recipe. "Look at the timing. Calls to this same number right before they moved into each new resort territory. Someone was feeding them intelligence, telling them which properties were vulnerable." Thompson entered, his face grave beneath a fresh dusting of snow. "It gets worse. FBI's forensic team found something interesting in those compounds Kovach's men tried to smuggle in. The base chemicals, they're military grade. The kind that don't just show up in mountain supply stores. Someone with serious connections was supplying them. Because the Shadow Peak gang wasn't just a criminal organization, James concluded, standing to study his evidence wall. They were a test run. Someone wanted to see how luxury resorts would respond to organized intimidation. The question is why. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, clutching a business magazine. "Maybe this is why," she said, dropping it on James's station. The headline read, "Mountain Resort Consolidation Bill Proposed. New Powers for Corporate Acquisition of At-Risk Properties." "Of course," James muttered, the pieces clicking into place like a perfectly timed sauce reduction. Create a crisis, then offer the solution. The Shadow Peak gang moves in, terrorizes independent resorts, and suddenly there's public support for corporate takeovers of unsafe properties. "You're saying this goes all the way to the resort conglomerates?" Sarah asked, incredulous. James picked up a photo of the Shadow Peak mountain lion symbol. "Look closer at the design, the artistry, the psychological impact. This isn't some biker gang tag. This is corporate psychological warfare. Someone wanted to make these properties feel helpless." Wilson rushed in, laptop in hand. "Chef, I've been tracing those encrypted communications. They bounce through servers across 3 states, but they all lead back to one location. Summit Hospitality Group's Special Acquisitions Division. The same corporation that tried to buy Golden Pine last year," James said quietly. "They thought they were placing a simple chef in charge of a doomed property. Instead, they got someone who specialized in tracking chemical weapons and neutralizing threats," Thompson finished. "Someone who could see the bigger picture." James moved to the window, watching his resort recover from the previous night's operation. The Shadow Peak riders were just pawns. The real threat wore suits and sat in corporate boardrooms. But they'd made one crucial mistake. "What's that?" Eleanor asked, still processing the scope of what they'd uncovered. "They assumed that because we're an independent resort, we'd be an easy target. They never understood that real strength doesn't come from corporate backing or gang intimidation. It comes from community." The office door opened again, revealing FBI Special Agent Diana Chen. "Chef Chen, we need to talk. Those connections you've uncovered, they go higher than you think, and you're not the only resort they've targeted." James tested the edge of his favorite knife, a habit now charged with new meaning. "How many others?" 8 properties across 4 states, all hit by similar gangs, all facing the same pressure for corporate buyouts. But Golden Pine was different. You didn't just stop their gang, you exposed their playbook. Thunder rolled across the peaks as James absorbed this information. The chemical expertise that had helped him take down the Shadow Peak gang wouldn't help against this enemy. This fight would require a different kind of recipe. The rapid gathering of evidence, the swift building of alliances with other targeted resorts. They thought catching Kovac and Stone was our endgame, James said, his voice steady despite the weight of the revelation. But everything we've done, the security systems, the surveillance network, the trust we've built, it's given us something they didn't expect. What's that? Sarah asked, already knowing they weren't done fighting. A foundation to fight back. And this time we're not just facing thugs on motorcycles. We're up against people who hide behind corporate logos and shareholder meetings. The quiet chef who had outsmarted the Shadow Peak gang was about to face a much deadlier game. One where the enemy smiled in board meetings and signed hostile takeover documents. The real war for Golden Pine's independence was just beginning, and James Chen was already mentally preparing a new menu, one designed to give corporate predators a taste of their own medicine. You know what they say in the kitchen, he mused, studying the evidence before them. The most dangerous ingredient isn't always the one that burns your tongue. Sometimes it's the subtle flavor you don't notice until it's too late. The mountain winds howled outside, carrying the promise of another storm. But in his kitchen, James Chen was already preparing a different kind of tempest, one that would show Summit Hospitality Group exactly why some chefs are better left in their independent kitchens, cooking up justice one carefully planned course at a time. The atmosphere in the emergency resort owners' meeting crackled with tension like oil in a hot pan. James stood before the gathered leaders of independent mountain properties, laying out evidence of the conspiracy that had brought the Shadow Peak gang to their doorsteps. Summit Hospitality Group Special Acquisitions Files, he announced, spreading documents across the conference table in Golden Pine's Grand Hall. Every resort they targeted followed the same pattern. First, a manufactured crisis, then conveniently timed offers for protective corporate acquisition. Margaret Hayes, who'd run Crystal Ridge Resort for 30 years, studied the files with growing concern. And you're saying someone in the corporate world orchestrated all this? Her voice trembled with barely contained anger. Not just someone, FBI agent Chen interjected, pulling up surveillance photos on the display screen. Marcus Sterling, head of Summit's Hostile Acquisitions Division. He's been pushing for legislation that would give his corporation direct control over at-risk mountain properties during crisis situations. James pointed to a series of financial trails meticulously documented. The Shadow Peak gang's weapons, their intelligence, even their tactical training, it all traces back to shell companies connected to Sterling's division. They're using orchestrated violence to justify corporate takeovers. But why? Resort owner Phillips demanded, his family's 3-generation legacy at stake. What does he gain from controlling independent mountain resorts? Control, James replied grimly, moving to his evidence board. Start with the luxury properties, then the smaller lodges, then the entire mountain tourism industry. Create enough crisis situations, and suddenly corporate oversight becomes the only option. But Sterling made 3 critical mistakes. He moved to the wall of photographs, tapping key images. First, he assumed a military-trained chef wouldn't recognize corporate warfare tactics. Second, he thought independent resorts would be isolated, easy to intimidate. And third, a commotion outside interrupted him. Sarah burst in, her expression urgent. Chef, Summit's security teams just set up checkpoints on all roads leading to independent resorts. They're citing ongoing gang activity as justification. And there's the third mistake, James concluded. They're moving too fast, getting sloppy. Sterling's worried about what we've uncovered. Agent Chen's phone buzzed. Similar reports from other targeted properties. It's a coordinated effort to lock down potential evidence. James checked his knife roll, mind racing through scenarios like complex recipe calculations. Sarah, get our documentation backed up to secure servers. Thompson, activate our emergency communication network between resorts. They think they're containing us, but they've just proven everything we suspected. Eleanor rushed in, tablet in hand. Chef, you need to see this. Corporate News is running a story about ongoing criminal elements in mountain resorts. They're saying last night's incident proves we need immediate corporate intervention. Of course they are, James said, his tactical training kicking in. They're controlling the narrative, but we've got something they don't expect. He pulled up a map showing connections between targeted resorts. While they were watching us handle the Shadow Peak gang, we were building a network. Every property they hit, every owner they tried to intimidate. We're all connected now, and we've got proof of their entire operation. Sterling's people will try to discredit it, Agent Chen warned. They'll call it conspiracy theories, desperate accusations from failing properties. James's response was cut short by the sound of helicopters overhead. Summit Hospitality Group's private security forces were deploying around the mountain properties, their show of force visible through the conference room windows. "Let them come," James said quietly, his voice carrying the same deadly certainty it had during covert operations. "Every move they make proves our case. The city chef they thought would fail against mountain bandits? He's about to show them that sometimes the quickest way to disable a predator isn't with force. It's with carefully gathered evidence served at precisely the right moment." Thunder rolled across the peaks as the resort owners prepared for a different kind of confrontation. This wasn't about outsmarting criminals anymore. It was about exposing corporate corruption that threatened the very heart of mountain hospitality. The real test of James's abilities wouldn't be his expertise with compounds and chemicals. It would be his skill at turning Sterling's own tactics against him, using the very network of resorts the corporation had tried to intimidate as the weapon that would bring them down. "Remember," James addressed the gathered owners, his chef's coat now a symbol of resistance rather than submission. "In cooking, as in justice, timing is everything. Sterling thinks he's forcing us to the table, but he doesn't realize. We've been preparing this meal since the moment he sent his first gang to our doors." The mountain winds howled outside, carrying snow and the promise of battle. But in the warm light of Golden Pine's Grand Hall, independent resort owners from across the ranges were discovering what the Shadow Peak gang had learned too late: that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who threatens with obvious force, but the quiet chef who knows exactly how to serve justice at the perfect temperature. The war for mountain independence was about to begin, and James Chen was ready to show Summit Hospitality Group why some recipes for justice are best served by those who understand that true power, like the perfect dish, requires not just skill and patience, but the courage to stand together when the heat is highest. James turned the Golden Pine kitchen into a command center as Summit's security forces encircled the mountain resorts. Surveillance feeds showed tactical teams positioning at every access road, their presence a clear message of corporate force. The same kitchen where he'd outmaneuvered the Shadow Peak gang was now the heart of a different kind of resistance. "They're shutting down cellular service," Sarah reported, monitoring communications. "Landlines still work, but they're definitely tapped." "Good thing we planned for this," James replied, activating a hidden satellite system installed beneath the herb garden. "Agent Chen, what's Summit's official position on this operation?" "Officially, they're claiming it's a joint security initiative responding to ongoing criminal activity. Unofficially, half the FBI's white-collar division is watching this closely. Sterling's overreach could expose years of corporate corruption." Thompson burst in, face grim beneath a fresh dusting of snow. "Summit's teams are going door to door at every independent resort, claiming to conduct safety inspections. They're confiscating computers, documents, anything that might have evidence." James moved to his evidence wall, now hidden behind a false freezer panel. "Let them search. Everything important is already backed up to secure locations around the world. Eleanor?" Eleanor's voice crackled through the radio. "My guests are spreading the word. Every piece of evidence, every recording is being distributed through the old Mountain Lodge network, just like we planned." "Sterling's making his play," James observed, checking the feeds. "He needs to control the narrative, make it look like independent resorts are hotbeds of criminal activity, justifying corporate intervention. But he's about to learn something about mountain communities." "What's that?" Agent Chen asked, reviewing satellite imagery of Summit's deployments. "Information moves faster through ski instructor gatherings than corporate channels." James activated the emergency broadcast system they'd established weeks ago. "All units execute Protocol Echo." Across the mountain ranges, a coordinated response began. Summit's security teams searching resorts found nothing but ordinary tourist operations. Every computer they seized contained only standard hospitality files. Meanwhile, the real evidence was moving through an underground network of ski patrols, maintenance crews, and local guide services. Sterling's people are getting frustrated, Sarah reported, monitoring corporate channels. They expected to find proof of ongoing criminal connections. Instead, they're finding ski lesson schedules and hot chocolate recipes. Because they don't understand how mountain communities work, James explained, carefully measuring ingredients for what appeared to be simple staff meals. They see us as isolated, vulnerable. They never realize that when you try to intimidate these resorts, you don't just face individual owners, you face generations of mountain connections they can't trace or control. A Summit Hospitality Group executive demanded entry to the kitchen. James buzzed him in, his posture relaxed but ready, the same stance that had faced down deadlier threats in darker places. Director Richard Drake strutted in, flanked by corporate security. Chef Chen, by order of Summit Hospitality Group's board of directors, this property is now under corporate receivership. Surrender your keys and operational codes. James's response was calm, measured like a perfect recipe. Interesting timing, Director. Right after we uncovered evidence linking corporate officers to organized crime. Would you like to explain these? He pulled up photos showing Drake meeting with Shadow Peak leaders weeks before their first attacks. The director's face hardened. You're interfering with a corporate security initiative. This kind of resistance only proves the need for professional oversight. No, James countered, stirring what appeared to be a simple soup. It proves exactly what we've been saying. This isn't about safety. It's about power, and you've just walked into your own trap. On cue, Eleanor's voice came through the radio. Chef, every major business publication in the country just received copies of our evidence. Social media is exploding. Corporate terrorism against independent resorts is trending nationwide. Drake's radio crackled with urgent messages. Summit's teams were facing peaceful but determined resistance across the mountains. Every attempt to suppress information only spread it faster through channels they couldn't control. You still think this is about chemical compounds and cooking skills? James asked quietly. The real power in these mountains was never in my specialized knowledge. It's in a community that knows how to stand together. Now, Director, would you like to rethink your position? Or should we discuss those Shadow Peak meetings on international business news? Thunder rolled across the peaks, but this time it sounded like victory approaching. The quiet chef they'd tried to silence was about to show them that in the modern age, the most dangerous weapon isn't force or fear. It's the truth in the hands of a united community. You know what they teach you in covert operations? James continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience. The most successful missions aren't the ones that end in confrontation. They're the ones where your opponent suddenly realizes they've already lost, and all that's left is to decide how gracefully they'll accept defeat. The mountain winds howled outside, carrying not just snow but the sound of approaching justice. Summit Hospitality Group was about to learn that some forces, like the mountains themselves, can't be conquered. They can only be respected or faced with the consequences of their arrogance. Marcus Sterling's face filled every television screen in Golden Pine's Grand Hall, his emergency press conference broadcast nationwide. The corporate titan's usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, his crisis management team hovering anxiously in the background. The situation in our mountain resort communities represents a clear threat to guest safety, he declared, desperation bleeding through his practiced corporate demeanor. The presence of organized criminal elements necessitates immediate corporate oversight. James sat at his kitchen counter, surrounded by his team, watching the man who'd orchestrated their torment dig his own grave with every carefully worded statement. What Sterling didn't know was that while he grandstanded, federal agents were executing search warrants across Summit Hospitality Group's offices. The timing is perfect, Agent Chen said quietly, reviewing real-time updates on her secure tablet. While he's trying to control the narrative, we're seizing every document, every server, every piece of the network you helped us uncover. The corporate equivalent of catching someone with their hand in the cookie jar. James thoughtfully stirred a cup of tea, the same steady hands that had prepared countless strategic compounds, now simply taking comfort in the familiar ritual. How widespread is it? Every shell company, every corrupt executive, every piece of Sterling's operation. The numbers are staggering. We're looking at over 50 million in illegal funds, connections to 3 other corporate takeover schemes, and evidence of similar operations planned for resort communities in 5 other states. Sarah burst in, her expression electric with news. "Chef, you need to see this. The other hotel corporations are falling all over themselves to distance from Summit. They're releasing documents showing Sterling tried to recruit them into his scheme. The whole industry is turning on him." "Of course they are," James replied, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "In both cooking and justice, there's a moment when everything reaches the perfect temperature. Push it too far, and suddenly your carefully crafted sauce becomes a liability." Thompson entered, bringing fresh intelligence. Summit's board of directors is calling an emergency session. Stocks are in freefall. But here's the interesting part. Remember those security teams they sent to intimidate us? Most of them were private military contractors. Guess who just handed over their complete communication logs to save themselves? The mountain winds outside had calmed, as if nature itself was pausing to watch justice unfold. James moved to his window, the same one where he'd first spotted the Shadow Peak gang months ago. Now he watched as Summit security teams quietly withdrew from their positions, corporate vehicles disappearing down mountain roads like shadows retreating before dawn. "You know what the biggest mistake in cooking is?" James asked, his voice carrying the weight of lessons learned in kitchens and covert operations alike. "It's not measuring wrong or using the wrong ingredient. It's underestimating the importance of patience. Sterling tried to force his recipe for corporate takeover before all the elements were properly prepared. Now he's watching it all curdle in front of the whole world." Eleanor joined them, Trevor safely by her side, watching Sterling's increasingly desperate press conference. "He still doesn't understand what went wrong, does he?" "No," James agreed, checking his knife roll out of habit, though its hidden compartments hadn't been needed since the night of the feast. He thought he could treat independent resorts like ingredients to be consumed. He never understood that we're more like a carefully tended sourdough starter, stronger because of our connections, our history, our community. Agent Chen's phone buzzed with updates. "FBI teams just found Sterling's private servers. The encryption is broken. James, the evidence. It's all there. Every plan, every payoff, every detail of how he intended to use manufactured terror to build his corporate empire. Send copies to every independent resort owner in the country," James instructed. "They need to know what to watch for, how to protect themselves. Sterling might be finished, but he's not the only corporate predator in these mountains." The screens showed Sterling's press conference deteriorating as reporters began asking about the FBI raids, his carefully constructed facade cracking under the pressure of truth. In Golden Pine's kitchen, James began preparing a simple meal, not the complex compounds of warfare, but the honest food of celebration. "You know," Sarah observed watching him work, "when you first came here, we all thought you were running from something. Turns out you were running toward something instead." James smiled, the expression genuine in a way his tactical training rarely allowed. Sometimes the best place to protect people isn't from behind enemy lines or in classified operations. Sometimes it's from behind a stove, serving something more powerful than any weapon: hope, community, and the kind of courage that comes from knowing you're not fighting alone. Thunder rolled one final time across the peaks, but now it sounded like applause. The quiet chef who'd outmaneuvered criminals and corporations had helped create something that would outlast any single victory, a blueprint for how independent businesses could stand against corporate intimidation, united in purpose and protected by truth. In Golden Pine's kitchen, James Chen continued cooking, knowing that sometimes the most powerful revolution isn't the one that comes with violence and chaos, but the one that simmers slowly, gathering strength like a perfectly crafted stock, until those who would destroy it find themselves consumed by their own toxic ambitions. 1 month after Sterling's arrest, Golden Pine Resort hosted a different kind of gathering. Representatives from 30 independent mountain properties across the country filled the grand dining hall, each with their own story of resistance against corporate corruption. "The final numbers are staggering," Agent Chen announced to the assembled crowd, her professional demeanor softened by genuine admiration. 43 corporate executives indicted, 22 corrupt security commanders arrested, over $150 million in seized assets from Sterling's operation. But the real story isn't in the numbers. James stood at his familiar position behind the kitchen counter, his chef's coat catching the morning light. The real story is how a network of independent resorts brought down a nationwide corporate criminal enterprise, not with violence or force, but with something stronger: unity, truth, and a few carefully crafted recipes. Thompson stepped forward with fresh intelligence reports. Sterling's operation went deeper than we thought. They had similar plans for resort communities in 6 other states. But guess what? Those plans are falling apart because every independent property is now watching, connected, ready to stand together. "Tell them about the changes, Chef," Eleanor called from her usual spot by the fireplace. James nodded, spreading out the new legislation drafts across the counter where he'd once prepared his strategic compounds. The State Tourism Board just passed the Independent Resort Protection Act. It guarantees autonomy for family-owned properties, requires transparency in corporate acquisitions, and establishes an oversight committee staffed by independent resort representatives. "And the FBI's new Resort Defense Unit?" Sarah added from her position by the pass. "They're using our playbook, teaching properties how to spot corporate manipulation, build evidence, and protect themselves without losing their independence." The meeting continued as owners and managers shared their experiences, building a stronger network of resistance against corporate corruption. But the most powerful moment came when a young chef from a neighboring resort asked the question everyone was thinking. "Chef Chen, you could have gone back to government work with your skills. Instead, you chose to protect mountain resorts. Why?" James paused in his preparation of the day's feast, his hand steady on his favorite knife. "Because it works," he replied simply. "Last month alone, 3 attempts at corporate hostile takeovers were stopped before they could even begin. Properties recognized the signs, worked together, protected each other." Outside, thunder rolled across the peaks, but now it carried a different message. Not a warning, but a reminder of how far they'd come. The quiet chef who'd outmaneuvered the Shadow Peak gang had helped create something that would outlast any single victory. A blueprint for independence standing strong against corporate greed, united in purpose and protected by truth. "Look at this," Eleanor beamed, watching the gathering from her restored office window. "Every one of these owners carries a piece of our story back to their properties. The ripple effect just keeps growing." James addressed the assembled crowd in the dining hall, his hands resting comfortably on his workstation. "1 year ago, we stood here facing a different kind of gathering. The Shadow Peak gang thought they could break our spirit. Sterling's corruption tried to steal our independence. But they taught us something invaluable. That true strength isn't in compounds or chemical knowledge." Thompson stepped forward with the latest intelligence. "It's in the bonds we build with each other." Sarah moved through the crowd, distributing detailed protocols they'd developed. "Tell them about the youth program, Chef." The newly established Young Hospitality Leadership Program had become a model for engaging the next generation in independent resort management. James watched as Trevor led a tour group through the kitchen, the teenager now confident in his role as apprentice chef. "That's our real victory," he said quietly. "Not just stopping corruption, but building something that will protect future generations." The thunder rolled once more across the peaks, but in Golden Pine Resort they no longer listened for warnings. They heard only the echo of triumph, the sound of communities united, standing strong against any storm that dared to threaten their way of life. The chef who'd been underestimated had become more than a defender. He'd become a symbol of hope for independent businesses everywhere. And in Golden Pine's kitchen, they knew that the most complex recipes weren't the ones that required exotic compounds or tactical precision, but the ones that called for courage, unity, and an unshakable faith in the power of community. "You know what they teach you in special operations?" James asked, beginning preparations for the celebration feast. "The strongest weapon isn't the one that destroys your enemy. It's the one that makes them realize they never should have chosen you as an enemy in the first place." The mountain winds carried the scent of his cooking across the property, no longer masking hidden compounds or tactical preparations, but simply promising the honest comfort of a meal prepared with pride and purpose. In kitchens across the country, other chefs were learning his lessons, not just about cooking, but about standing together, protecting what matters most, and remembering that sometimes the quietest member of the staff might just be the one most prepared to defend everything they hold dear. The legacy of the kitchen boy lived on, not in the precision of his tactical knowledge, but in the strength of resorts across the world, united in purpose, protected by truth, and forever changed by the lesson of a mountain community that dared to stand against corruption and won. 5 years after the Shadow Peak gang's defeat and Sterling's downfall, Golden Pine Resort had become a beacon of independent hospitality excellence. James stood in his expanded kitchen, watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks in shades of amber and gold, just as he had on that first morning that seemed a lifetime ago. "Final report on the national impact," Agent Chen announced, setting down a comprehensive file that smelled of fresh ink and victory. Over 700 independent properties have adopted the Golden Pine Protocol. Corporate interference investigations have exposed similar schemes in 20 states, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. Below, the resort bustled with activity. The expanded culinary training center hosted hospitality professionals from 5 countries. The kitchen, once his tactical command center, had become a hub of legitimate innovation. The Defense Chef Academy, named despite James's protests, taught not just cooking but community protection strategies. "Remember when they mocked you as kitchen boy?" Thompson mused, joining him at the pass. "Now it's a symbol of something bigger, how independent businesses can defend themselves against corporate predators." James checked his knife roll one last time, the motion now pure ritual. The hidden compartments that once held tactical compounds now contained only the finest spices. The chemical expertise was never the real strength. It was just what got their attention. Sarah burst in with breaking news, her excited voice carrying across the kitchen. "Another hostile takeover attempt exposed in the Rockies. Fell apart in days because the properties recognized the signs. They used our playbook." The morning sun caught James's chef's coat as he addressed the gathered trainees. "They called me kitchen boy thinking it was a joke, but here's what they never understood. The finest meal isn't what makes a resort safe. It's the courage to stand together, the wisdom to recognize threats, and the strength to protect what matters." Thunder rolled across the peaks, but in Golden Pine Resort, they'd learned to hear it differently. Not as a warning, but as a reminder of battles won and lessons learned. The quiet chef with the tactical background had shown the hospitality industry that true protection comes not from the complexity of compounds, but from the unbreakable bonds of community. As training continued below, James watched the next generation prepare to defend their independent properties. They practiced cooking techniques, but they understood the deeper truth, that the strongest defense against corporate corruption isn't found in secret recipes, but in the hearts of people who refuse to be intimidated. "Look at this," Eleanor beamed, watching the gathering from her expanded office. "Every one of these trainees carries our story back to their properties. The revolution just keeps spreading." The legacy of Golden Pine wasn't just about a chef who could outmaneuver criminals and corporations. It was about showing the world that when independent businesses stand together, no force of greed can tear them apart. The quiet cook's triumph had become a template for resistance across the industry. "Tell them about the international program," Thompson urged, bringing in fresh reports. 4 more countries adopted our model last month alone. James watched as his students demonstrated the techniques that had helped take down both the Shadow Peak gang and Sterling's corporate empire. But now they understood that chemical knowledge was just one small part of the equation. "The defense network spans 5 continents now," Agent Chen reported. "Every month we get reports of corporate schemes shut down before they can take root. Properties recognizing the signs, working together, protecting each other." A young trainee raised her hand. "Chef Chen, what's the most important lesson from the Shadow Peak incident?" James drew his favorite knife one last time, the motion smooth as silk, but instead of demonstrating his precise cutting technique, he carefully began preparing a simple, honest meal. "The lesson isn't about how to fight back. It's about knowing how to prevent the fight in the first place." True strength isn't in tactical knowledge. It's in the community behind the kitchen door. The thunder rolled across the peaks one final time, but now it carried a message of triumph. The sound of independent businesses united, standing strong against corruption, protecting what matters most through unity, courage, and an unshakable belief in the power of standing together. In the years to come, they would tell stories about the quiet chef with the tactical background. But in Golden Pine Resort, they knew the truth, that the surest path to security isn't through hidden compounds or secret operations, but through the hearts of people who choose to stand together, protecting their way of life with something stronger than any weapon: unbreakable community bonds. The legacy of Kitchen Boy lived on, not in the precision of his defensive techniques, but in the strength of resorts across the world, united in purpose, protected by truth, and forever changed by the lesson of a mountain community that dared to stand against corruption and won. In James Chen's kitchen, they still prepared meals with the same careful attention to detail, but now they served something far more powerful than justice. They served hope, unity, and the unshakable spirit of independence that no corporate force could ever buy or break. As winter snow began to fall outside his kitchen window, James smiled, knowing that his greatest recipe wasn't found in any tactical manual or cookbook. It was in showing the world that sometimes the quietest voice in the room might just belong to the one person capable of changing everything, one carefully prepared meal at a time. No thunder could ever match the legacy of James Chen, the quiet chef who transformed a simple mountain kitchen into a symbol of independence. From the Shadow Peak Gang's defeat to Sterling's corporate downfall, his story became more than just a tale of tactical expertise. It became a blueprint for resistance. Today, independent resorts across the world use the Golden Pine Protocol, named after the place where a supposed city cook showed that true power isn't measured in compounds or corporate wealth, but in the strength of communities standing together. The Defense Chef Academy trains a new generation, not just in culinary arts, but in the subtle art of protecting what matters most. They still tell stories about the night when bandits mocked a quiet cook, not realizing they were being served their last meal by a man whose military expertise had earned him the name Last Meal Chen. They whisper about how corporate titan Marcus Sterling's empire crumbled against the most unexpected of opponents, a chef whose greatest weapon wasn't his tactical knowledge, but his ability to unite a community. In Golden Pine's kitchen, James still cooks with the same precision that once served justice to those who threatened his mountain home. But these days, his recipes create something far more powerful than retribution. They build bonds between independent properties strong enough to resist any corporate storm. They called him Kitchen Boy as a joke, never suspecting that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the one that comes at you with guns or corporate takeover bids. It's the quiet one who serves your defeat with a perfect garnish and a lesson about underestimating those who choose to stand together. For in the end, the most powerful weapon wasn't found in his knife roll or hidden compounds. It was in showing the world that true strength comes from the courage to protect not just a kitchen, but a way of life worth fighting for.